In this segment, I want to shift away from foreign policy, and I kind of hinted we were going this direction when I talked about OPEC and the oil embargo of the early 1970s. But I want to talk about domestic issues, and I want to start out by talking about the economy. One of the key factors in the 1970s and this questioning of America's future, I think, really came from the economic situation that the U.S. faced in the 1970s. At the heart of that economic situation is something called stagflation. 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 To start out here, if you think about expectations, just kind of your basic economics, if you have rising demand for goods, you should see inflation of prices. Growing economy means that more people are buying, and as demand increases and supply decreases, what's available to buy decreases, then the person selling can raise prices. And that's inflation, right? Inflation is when prices go up, or you might put it another way, the value of the individual dollar declines. In other words, what a dollar will actually buy declines. And you can see that in a box of cereal. Box of cereal costs $1, and then the price goes up to $2.99 or $3.99 a box or more. Well, that's inflation. Instead of buying you a whole box of cereal, your $1 really will only buy you, a quarter of a box of cereal? Because it's going to take 4 of those dollars to get the whole box. That's inflation. Prices go up, the value of the dollar really goes down, what it'll buy. That's in a growing economy, but what if you have a situation like the Great Depression? Then you have people buying less, demand goes down, and what you would expect is that unemployment goes up, right? There are fewer people that are needed to produce goods, so they get laid off. Unemployment goes up, and you have deflation. Right? You can't get people to buy your stuff if you're a producer. Stagflation is where you sort of have the worst of both worlds. And that's what hit the United States in the 1970s. On the one hand, you have a stagnant economy, which is effectively in a state of either non-growth or recession, not economic depression, but recession, so that you have very minimal growth. But then you also have unemployment. The economy's growing, but you've got unemployment. And then on top of that, you have inflation. Prices are going up, people are being unemployed, and the economy is not growing at any sort of a rate that can keep up with inflation. So people begin to feel that what they can afford, that their standard of living is threatened. Let's start out just briefly, and let me give you some statistics here. In terms of unemployment, in the 1960s, the average unemployment rate annually for the United States was about 4.8%. That had gone up in the early 1970s to an average of about 5.4%. And by the late 1970s would average approximately 7%. The high during this sort of era, the highest unemployment would be achieved in 1982, where it ran about 9.7%, almost 10% unemployment. So over the course of the 1970s, it doesn't look like things are getting better or even staying the same. It looks statistically as if things are getting worse. In terms of inflation, by January of 1971, inflation was running at about 5.3% annually, but it continues to rise. 1973, the same time as we're seeing the oil embargo, and you can imagine what happens to gas prices. They go up enormously during this as a result of the embargo. Inflation has jumped to about 9% annually. 1974, that's going to go up to 12%. 1980, almost 14%. So that over the course of the decade, things don't look better or the same, they look worse. There are a number of factors behind what's happening. And I've mentioned, of course, OPEC and the oil embargo and what that does, creating what has been called an energy crisis in the United States. It's like going to a buffet, you know. I mean, we thought it was all you can eat in terms of oil. But the 1970s was a wake-up. You know, and that's what I'm talking about in terms of the mentality of the 70s. This wait a minute, can we continue to do things the way we've been doing things here in the U.S.? But another major factor coming out of the 1960s were the policies of Lyndon Johnson. Remember that Lyndon Johnson had avoided sort of placing on the American public any kind of substantial financial hardships as a result of Vietnam. And he had continued creating federal programs through the Great Society so that, in essence, he's paying for the war and he's also seeking to pay for these new programs of the Great Society without major tax increases or other, money-raising schemes like Liberty bonds and all that kind of stuff that normally the U.S. has used to pay for its wars. Going all the way back to the Revolution, where we got massive debt trying to fight that. Historians have used the phrase guns and butter, that LBJ wanted Americans, he wanted guns, but he also wanted butter. He wanted the extra on the toast in terms of domestic spending. The result, you would imagine over time, would be inflationary as massive amounts of federal dollars are pumped into the economy for military spending, but also through these government programs. I think those short-term explanations are important. And they go a long way to explaining what's happening in the very early 1970s, in the early years of the Nixon administration. But as we look at the 1970s, as we expand out further and look at American history since, I think it's pretty clear, looking back anyway, that we see emerging in the 1970s some very definite evidence of really almost structural changes occurring in the United States economy. These are long-term efficiencies, you might say, to use sort of jargon. But efficiencies, as they've meant when we talked about industrialization in the U.S. post-Civil War, efficiencies mean that you're replacing human labor with technology. You're pushing productivity. And there are repercussions. There are repercussions whenever that occurs. First of all, in manufacturing, let's talk manufacturing just briefly. And I want to use the example of steel. And if you look at steel, the steel industry from 1947, just post-war, to 1977, the U.S.'s output of steel actually doubles during this period. But at the same time, the American workforce, the steel workforce, is being cut. And it's cut the same period, the production's doubling, the workforce is cut by about 30%. Now, part of the reason for this manufacturing decline in the United States will be that, by and large, the U.S. dollar remains strong compared to other currencies. There is still considerable faith in the United States and its economic position going into the future, at least abroad. But I think something else we have to think about is just time and recovery. That from the late 1940s through the early 1970s, the United States was the productive engine of the world. Most of the rest of the world had been destroyed, decimated by the Second World War. The major economies, think about Germany, think about Britain, think about France, but also think about Japan. Major economic engines in the world had not been in a position since World War II to actually produce products that would compete with the United States. And so what we begin to see is a situation in the United States in which high wages and high costs of production produce products that simply cannot compete, and also add in a strong dollar, cannot compete with products being produced more cheaply abroad. They may not be the same quality, they may not be as good at least, in the early 1970s, but they're cheap and they're competitive. And the U.S. will begin to see the results of this competition. And how it's going to play out in the 1970s will be through the so-called Rust Belt. This is a stretch of industrial cities across the American North, the northern United States, places like Allentown, Pennsylvania, and Gary, Indiana, and major cities where you see these sort of high-paying union jobs disappearing, and you see the communities where so many workers had flocked during the Second World War for industrial employment. Whole portions of the city began to fade, began to disappear. The term that's often been used is the Rust Belt, the old focal points for American industry and manufacturing. They begin to decline. Jobs are lost, plants close, largely in the face of foreign competition. But also a shift in the United States toward the service sector and away from manufacturing. This trend is also happening, though, it's not just in manufacturing, it's also in some place you might not think to look, and that's agriculture. And that's a big one. It's a big deal. As with industry, as with manufacturing, technology will play an increasing role in American agriculture. First of all, we have the introduction post-World War II of machinery, and that's primarily tractors. We also have the introduction of chemical fertilizers, and we have the introduction of herbicides like Roundup. These are chemical treatments designed to kill certain species of weed, which diminish the amount of labor required to keep fields, crops, weeded and weed-free. Chemical fertilizers increase the productivity of plants. And of course, we also have certain amounts of scientific engineering and hybridization going on, which allow for greater yields off the same amount of land. So we're introducing new technologies, which are actually, as with machines in industry, they come with some expense. They're not cheap. What this ultimately will mean is that farmers who cannot achieve efficiencies of scale will be pushed out of agriculture. In other words, if my farm is just a few acres, I cannot as easily afford these new technologies as a farmer who is farming a vast acreage. It's like the huge corporation versus the little mom and pop factory, or the huge retail store that's nationwide that can purchase in volume and create certain efficiencies in management that the little mom and pop retail store just can't achieve. So what we see in the U.S. is influenced by technology, but it's also being influenced by global markets. In the early 1970s, there's huge demand for American agricultural products. Huge demand. Part of it's just natural, environmental. There are famines, around the world, and the U.S. is producing vast quantities of crops. And in fact, the Nixon administration will encourage greater production. And when the production looks good and it looks like the U.S. is set and there's real money to be made in agriculture, you see farmers seeking to expand. And throughout much of the 1970s, that's exactly what they did. If I'm going to make this much money off of X number of acres, if I add more acres to what I own, how much more money can I make here in the boom times? So farmers are taking out loans. They're expanding their acreage. They're investing in machinery to be more efficient. And what happens then by the early 1980s when the market slumps is that these farmers are left holding the bag, so to speak, sort of an empty bag. But they often can't make the payments, and they end up losing their land. So the overall trend in the United States during the 1970s, which is leading toward unemployment, right? But it's also sort of operating within these inflationary pressures, will be the loss of American farms. Just to give you some idea, in 1960, there were approximately 4 million farms operating in the United States. By 1980, just 20 years later, that number had gone down to 2.4 million farms. And by the year 2000, we're down to approximately 1.9 million farms. So overall, we see the diminution of traditional sectors of the American economy and real questions about what form they'll take and what it will mean for many, many Americans who depended upon these sectors of the economy for jobs, good jobs, union jobs, high-wage jobs that are now being lost in part to competition, in part to greater efficiencies being sought after as a result of that competition, and in agriculture for other reasons. So, you can begin to see, I hope, both with what we saw in Vietnam, with OPEC and the oil embargo, and then on the domestic side with the economy, hopefully you can begin to see why in the 1970s Americans might question what the future would hold for them and for the United States. The next segment I'll take up with some other domestic issues, and we'll go from there.